Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Amira Dhalla from Consumer Reports, and I am really excited for our panel today. As a follow up to our 2 week screening on the groundbreaking documentary Coded Bias, we've brought together a stellar, and I cannot emphasize that enough, a stellar lineup of people and experts to talk about the future of algorithmic justice and how it affects our democracy and our civil rights. So, as someone who's kept their eye on algorithmic bias and the effects that it has on us and our democracy for quite a while, I was personally really eager to watch the film Coded Bias. And after watching it, I was even more eager to continue jumping into the question of what next? Where do we go from here? How do we need to bring more justice to these issues? And so, you might be like me and have come here for that conversation on where do we go now that we are more aware of the biases and more people are becoming aware of them. And so I really wanted to bring together this group of experts from civil society and social justice organizations and the documentary to discuss how we can create awareness and accountability around algorithmic justice issues. And a few housekeeping items before we get started. So I am very excited for the many people that are here today, and I encourage you to participate with us. So join in on the chat function. You can ask your questions there. You can show your support there. Virtual hands, jazz hands are totally encouraged. I also want to let you know that we are recording. We want to be able to share this panel with those who are unable to attend today. So be wary when you are talking in the chat and do not share any personal information. I also want to let you know that we are enabling closed captioning. So if you follow the instructions in the bottom of your Zoom, you will be able to turn them on. Okay, so I'm telling you, this group of people that we have here today is what is exciting me the most. So I want to say a big warm welcome and thank you to those that are joining me. So Shalini Kantayya, the director of Coded Bias documentary. Kasia Chmielinski, the project lead of the Data Nutrition Project. Jade Magnus Ogunnake, the senior campaign director at Color of Change. And Joy Bulamwini, the founder of Algorithmic Justice League and the star of the film Coded Bias. So hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining me today and being here. You can get off mute, say hi, virtual waves.
What's up? Poet of Code from AJL headquarters.
Yes, I have to say everyone's backgrounds are just stellar right now. I really appreciate everyone bringing their A game to videos these days.
All good.
Yeah, I'm going to jump right into the questions because I know that many people have been waiting for that, and our participants are so eager to hear what you all have to say. I'm going to start with a little bit more of a simple question on the documentary and just address like, how did we feel after we watched it? I know I was left with so many emotions, ranging from the frustration to the anger to the being inspired. So I really want to talk to you all to say, what parts of it did you find inspiring? What parts of it did you find scary? And even as we relate that to AI, machine learning, algorithm bias, how do we see those all ranging in there as well? And Shalini, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot first and just say what did you want the viewers of the documentary to leave feeling?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And thank you to Consumer Reports for hosting such an engaging conversation with this all-star cast. It's really an honor to share the film with you, with this audience. I think, in the making of this film, I learned some alarming things that I sought to share with the audience. And I think everything that I knew about AI sort of had come from the brain of Steven Spielberg or Stanley Kubrick, sort of this imagined AI. And I don't think I really realized the extent to which AI is increasingly becoming this gatekeeper of human destiny, deciding, really important things that govern opportunity, like who gets hired, who gets what quality of healthcare, who gets undue police scrutiny. And I think I'm so grateful to the brilliant cast of the film and to Joy for her incredible research, for helping me understand how these systems work. And I think what was so terrifying with this understanding of the fact that we're outsourcing our decision making to machines was also this revelation that came through Joy's research and the research of others, that of inherent bias in all of these systems. And what I learned is that these systems that are being that are governing, opportunity and often civil liberties in such intimate ways haven't been vetted for racial bias, for gender bias, or even for accuracy. And that is when I began to understand that this is the civil rights issue of our times.
I feel strongly about that too, but I do want to leave room for everyone else to jump in. Any post-documentary reactions or just reactions to where we are with AI right now?
I can jump in. So hi everyone, I'm Kasia. Thank you so much for having me on the panel, and thanks to Consumer Reports as well. I think for me, I mean, I love the film, so thank you so much for making it, putting it out there. I was really struck by the accessibility of the narrative. So as someone who's more on the practitioner side, working with big data and building lots of technology on that data, I know about the ins and outs of these kinds of things, and I've seen them for years and have been very concerned about it. But I felt that the narrative in the documentary was so easy to understand the way that you laid it out, and really it wasn't talking down to anybody, but it was just clarifying, like, this is what's going on, and here are all these examples that relate directly to your lives in ways that you can really empathize and sympathize with, and then even can see relationship to in your own life. And then I was also kind of on the flip side of that, really impressed by the more subtle nature of the documentary. Who got to speak? Who did you choose as your spokespeople? Who was your cast? Which voices were uplifted? And I would say that I was really pleased by that, because as someone who works in the industry, that's not representative of what you normally see in the kinds of conversations you have. So it felt like a story, but it also felt like a work of activism. So thank you. Thanks for putting the film out there.
Yeah, for me, watching the film is weird because it's all of these things that have happened over time. It's 2 years of Shalini being there with the crew, my getting used to it, and then sometimes fading in the background. I do own more than one shirt, which might not be apparent throughout the film, but just wanted to put that out there. But something that really struck me watching it again is the sisterhood that you see throughout the film, and how reading Kathy's book as I was at MIT wondering if I wanted to shift direction, right? Weapons of mass destruction, and actually going to the Harvard bookstore, and she was there. I started talking about things with facial recognition. I could tell it wasn't quite connecting at that point, but it was, oh, there's somebody else noticing these issues. And I also just appreciate the arc of the film, right? Going from that in the lab discovery to, okay, being out in the real world. And a part of the film that's captured that really meant so much to me was the opportunity to connect with the Brooklyn tenants. And I love that scene where Icy May, she's like, oh my goodness, it got this far, right? And you pull back out to where all of these narratives and all of these journeys are converging. And I also just have to give a hat tip to Shalini, because there was so much information from many knowledgeable people throughout the entire film. And so to weave a coherent narrative out of that was no small task. And so I walked away like, wow, I've never seen a film like this. And when I hear the response to it on social media, people talk about, for example, the hair scene where, my stylist is doing my hair. And it's like, would you really see that in many AI documentaries and so forth, or just the subtle things? So I truly appreciated the craft of how it was all presented, and also the opportunity to make sure people are aware that these AI systems are infiltrating our lives right now, and there is a need for algorithmic justice.
Thank you so much, Consumer Reports. Again, I'm Jade Magnus Ogunnake from Color of Change, and so excited to be on the panel with all of these esteemed panelists. First of all, I think the thing that really strikes me about Coded Bias is that it's a documentary that centers Black people and Black women particularly. Earlier in the year, we all saw Social Network, which was, of course, super interesting. And it was about, sort of the personal addiction that we have to social media due to algorithmic bias. What I love about this documentary is that it zooms way out. It's less about us sort of like clicking on and buying things and Instagram overhearing our conversations. Not that that's not super important, but it really zooms out and I think particularly does an incredible job of showing the way that algorithmic bias is a feeder for mass incarceration. One of the most sort of striking scenes happened in the UK when a gentleman was ticketed for not wanting his face to be scanned. Obviously we have totally different criminal justice systems in Western Europe than we do in the United States. But it totally reminded me of what happened a couple years ago in Detroit when a Black man was wrongfully named as a suspect for the robbery of a jewelry store due to algorithmic bias, and was tackled and arrested in front of his family until they took him back into the interrogation room and realized that it wasn't the right person. I love that this documentary sort of zooms out on, I think we have this tendency to view tech as super progressive, maybe because it's just like young, we view them as like young white guys on the West Coast. And so we have this tendency to view tech as this really progressive humanitarian space when they're simply corporations like any other.
Yeah, definitely. And so much of that resonates with me too, like having grown up and been working in this for so long, like just seeing all of this come to light in a way that was represented, that was actually in a way that people could hear and understand it was so mind blowing that I was like, I just want as many people as I know to watch this so that they can be in the place where I am now, which is like, let's take action. Let's do something about this. And so that's kind of where we're at with the convening of this panel and why we wanted to focus on the movement forward. But how do we continue to build that awareness on the emerging harms of algorithmic bias? How do we popularize it so that we're able to reach more people and it's part of a social movement? Because I still think we're in a small subset and there's a lot of room to go. And that's where I really think there's leaders like you all to like help us guide and get there. And many people are still not aware of the biases that could occur, but yet are getting AI systems into their offices, into their homes, like very quickly. So I think we need that like awareness to move as quickly as the production and like how these things are coming into our lives. And I just want to have that conversation on like, how do we popularize this? And Joy, if you don't mind, I want to start with you just because as a poet of code, you use this beautiful way of bringing art and storytelling to move beyond researchers, and your videos with poetry have been such a expressive way to get beyond just the normal consumers who are used to this. And I want you to dig in on like, how do we have more of this? How do we get more from the poet of code? And like, what else can we do in this area?
Now, I'm so glad you're asking this question, and it's something we focus on at the Algorithmic Justice League. We talk about, you've heard of the male gaze, the white gaze. Well, now we have the coded gaze. And the coded gaze, like the other ones, right, is a reflection of who has power, right, to set the priorities for where tech is going. And it's usually not people who look like me or the rest of us within this group. And so the importance of who gets to tell the story, I think, is crucial. I love that in the film we have people like Daniel Santos and we have Trinae, right, sharing their own work within their communities to make change. And I think those stories are so incredibly valuable because it goes against the narrative that there's nothing that can be done. They got it shut down, right, with the Brooklyn tenants, or this value added system that's in the film and the unions pushing against it. And so I think it's important not to just raise awareness that there's bias and there's systematic racism and sexism that's being encoded, because it can feel like, well, here's another thing, we got problems, but also alongside that, to show the wins that are happening. When we look at the area of facial recognition technology, so many cities that have passed bans or moratoria, and then even having IBM and Amazon, who you see in the film, pushing back, and Microsoft stepping away from selling to law enforcement in different capacity. I think it's incredibly important that, first of all, we share stories so people even know what AI harms look like. I know folks are like, what machines can, like, what's going on? So help people get the language, but also see how it impacts their lives. But then do that bridging step of saying, okay, there's something that can be done. With my own work, because I wear the researcher hat, I'm a computer scientist, I also think about how do you move from performance metrics, what I might share at a research conference or publish in a paper, to performance arts, so that the impact of what the findings are truly resonate with various individuals.
Thank you. And Kasia, on the other end, like the data nutrition label blows my mind and makes me so excited. But like, how do we create, like, can you first of all explain it to everyone and then talk about like, how do we show the biases and create more inclusive algorithms by labeling these things and bringing consumers more aware to what's happening with the tools they're using?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's ever said that DNP has blown their mind, so I'm like really excited about that. So I love this idea of the coded gaze. I would also say that kind of another level of that is that there are people who are controlling the robot that's gazing, right? So the way that we're looking at it is kind of from the practitioner lens, right? So there are people who are building these algorithms, there are people who are making decisions all along the way to actually encode the bias that's in the data underlying the algorithms that then gets coded into the algorithm and then used on lots of people. So although we're focused a lot on general education, that's why our project I think has an analogy, which is nutritional labels for food. That's very easy to understand. The tool that we're actually building is essentially a nutritional label on a data set that will tell practitioners who are about to use that data set whether or not it's healthy for the thing they're trying to do. And if it's not healthy for the thing they're trying to do, build a model, let's say, then it will give some mitigation strategies around how can you actually build a better model on that data, or maybe you shouldn't use that data at all. Because what we've seen is, and I think the movie also highlights this so well, that if the underlying data is problematic, the model is just learning off of things that happened in the past. And then it's going to decide and predict things for the future that now look an awful lot like the past because the data that it was built on was problematic. So it's going to start to just perpetuate those same issues over and over again. So what we're trying to do at DNP is really look at the data and build these nutritional labels for data sets so that other people who are going out there and picking up data sets to use them in their algorithms can better understand whether the data is healthy for them before they decide their model is going to consume it. And so that's really the way that we're looking at it is kind of from the inside out, saying, yes, general understanding and education is super important because we need to have that accountability, that drive to accountability and responsibility coming from the public, from policy, from regulatory bodies. But then at the end of the day, if you're a practitioner inside a company, you also need to understand what you can actually do about it as a person who is, tweaking the levers and all of that and deciding what we build, how we build it, and, whether we should build it at all, honestly.
And I do want to add one other component here. Last week, we had a workshop, and it was a facilitator's workshop for a project we've been doing called Drag versus AI. And so we partner with local drag queens. We first did it with the library, Boston Public Library, and teenagers there. And part of what we were trying to do was increase the surface area for engagement, right? So you might not think about drag and makeup and so forth as a pathway into learning about surveillance or into learning about AI systems, but these other ways of bringing people in where there's a hands-on component so it doesn't feel so foreign, because to the earlier point, there are the people who are inside the companies working on it, and there can sometimes be this barrier that if I'm not a practitioner, if I'm not a data scientist, if I don't have a PhD in computer science, etc., this isn't for me. And with AJL, we keep emphasizing if you have a face, you have a place in this conversation. And part of it is also taking away the mystery, where it's like, yes, it's people with flaws who build flawed technologies that can have real world consequences in your life as well. So that's another way. Drag versus AI, if you check out the AJL site, you can find out more materials there. But what really struck me in doing that workshop was seeing how people responded to different experiences. So one person might look at the cameras like, oh, it seems like it's reading me fine. The other person is having a completely different experience. And you don't necessarily see that when we're in our siloed tech experiences. And I do think it's vitally important that we're sharing a variety of different kinds of experiences so people can look and say, oh, I actually do identify with this one or that one.
Yeah, that's so important. And I really think like the combination of this, both in the research and academic and what we're creating, will help move that forward. Shalini, I really also want to hear from you on this one, just because you did that next step in my mind. You created a documentary on these issues. You went to that level of creating the awareness. And so in your perspective, like, what is the next step from here to create the next level of awareness?
Well, I hope people will watch the film and share it in their communities. I'm being really serious. I mean, I think that what the film seeks to do is one, have some vital science communication. I'm so grateful to people like Joy and sort of the brilliant and badass cast of my film for giving me an education and helping me understand these concepts. And what I realized is that knowledge is power. And all the knowledge has been concentrated in the hands of a few. So all of the power is concentrated in the hands of a few. And I'm so grateful for these sort of people like Joy and Tech who help us, who bridge that world for us. And I think that what I hope Coded Bias does is show us that we all have a place at the table in the conversations about how algorithms get deployed in the 21st century. Like, that shouldn't be just up to the tech bros to decide, because we all have a place at the table. And for me, even how I come to these issues, like 3 years ago, I didn't even know what an algorithm was, is through people, like, and through stories. And people may not care about bias in AI, but they care, but through Coded Bias, they care about Joy, and they go on a journey with her, and they see how much she cares about the issues, and her as a translator. And I think that helps show. And I think that I'm really grateful to people like Trinae Moran and Daniel Santos. I mean, they don't come from a tech background, and yet they were actively able to challenge power and to win. And I think that comes from empowering ourselves with the science and not being afraid. I think both Daniel and Trinae and when I've spoken to them have said like that there was this fear that they had to get over of not knowing the science so that they could challenge those technological systems of power. And that's by design. And so I hope that the film levels the playing field and helps us all have a collective conversation. And I think I'm so grateful to the data scientists and the mathematicians in the film, because they're not just incredibly astute. I think there are like 7 PhDs in the film, some of the smartest people I ever met, but also are connecting it to the communities that could actually be hurt and most hurt by these technologies. And I think in the making of this film, I've seen a real model for how social change can happen, which is that, brave scientists unencumbered by corporate interests have to be able to share their research. I mean, it's incredible to me that Joy's research helped change the 3 biggest tech companies in the world's policies towards using facial recognition by law enforcement. That was a huge feat. I mean, IBM said they would get out of the game and stop researching it. And Microsoft said that they would stop selling it to police. And Amazon said they would put a 1-year pause. And to me, that was sea change that we never thought was possible. But that happened also in June of 2020. And that timing was essential because that was when engaged citizens were making their voices heard on the streets and making the connection between racially biased invasive surveillance technologies and the inherent value of Black life. But to me, I feel like I'm really grateful to Joy, because I want to say like how vulnerable it is for scientists to have to put their academic reputations on the line to speak out against these big companies. And we're seeing that time and time again, and they shouldn't have to. And so we need better systems to protect these scientists who are, in my opinion, working in the public good. They're helping keep our democracies safer by exposing these biases. And, you know, what was so alarming to me, I think Joy was testifying before Congress, and Jim Jordan, a right-wing Republican, there was a moment where he says, like, wait a minute, 117 million Americans are in a police database and no one in an elected office is overseeing this. And that's when I began to realize, like, this stuff is going from big tech straight to law enforcement with no government in place and no rules in place. And so we need better safeguards for scientists to do this work. And we need more people at the table so we can all have this collective conversation.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, because while I started with the research, I remember meeting Cade Crawford with ACLU Massachusetts and really learning, okay, it's one thing bringing the research in, right? But how are you connecting with communities as well? What are the larger plays going on to really challenge power? And so I felt like throughout my journey and also continuing, I was getting a real education from many different groups that I was engaging with, Direct Action from Fight for the Future, Mehente. There are just so many different groups where I was like, this is what they do, right? I'm out here researching these algorithms. They out here challenging power. Let's put it together and see where we can move from there. And so that was also an area that I had to be conscious about, because you're not necessarily rewarded for that in the research community. Publish your papers, get your degrees, go to your conferences, etc. So a lot of the work that I've been doing that I find so incredibly meaningful, because it's being done in community with so many organizations and individuals as well, I'm not incentivized to do this. Even when I mentioned to others, you know, there's this documentary that's going on, I was asked, is this worth your time to put in? You know, and people who are like strategists about how you should influence power. And I was like, the storytelling component, when I look at the work of the Algorithmic Justice League, when I think about being a poet of code, is that if you have a voice, right, you should have a choice, and we should have the choice to speak up and stand up around issues we care about. And there were so many forces, right, telling me that I shouldn't speak up, or this doesn't matter, or this won't really help you individually in your career, right? Or why are you spending time with filmmakers? And so to see Coded Bias come out and the impact it's having, this is the answer to those questions, because it matters that people see what's at stake and that they see their lives and their voices reflected.
Definitely. And we're going to veer into that a little bit, but I do want to give Jade a chance to weigh in here, because we brought up like IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon who put the moratoriums on. And in my perspective, like Color Change is just one of those organizations that has been so fundamental to holding people in power accountable. And so I really want to hear from your perspective, Jade, like what is the role of organizations like Color Change and others? Like, do we do this collaboratively? How do we go forward with doing this? And how do we continue to hold these organizations accountable for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, Color of Change is the nation's largest digital racial justice organization with more than 7 million members. We are also a Black organization, a Black-led organization. And, you know, I started at Color of Change 4 years ago, and we've been doing this sort of tech platform accountability work since I've been there, and, you know, before that as well. One of the sort of earliest campaigns I remember working on was around IBM. Ginny Rometry, the CEO at the time, she's still the CEO, had reached out to Trump with an offer to work with him. And she was super excited to work with Trump. She was sort of, you know, extending an olive branch per se. And she was doing more than extending an olive branch, because she was offering the power, their surveillance and the technology of IBM to sort of aid Trump's goals and aims. And one of the first things, one of the first campaigns I worked on when I started at Color of Change was asking companies like IBM to refuse to help Trump build a Muslim registry. And so we've sort of seen, you know, another campaign I ran shortly after that was during the Muslim ban, when Trump issued the executive order banning Muslim immigrants to the United States. And the Bangladeshi taxi drivers had gone on strike at JFK Airport, and Uber decided to totally eliminate their surge pricing at that time, break the strike line, and enter into JFK Airport. I don't know if y'all remember, it was trending everywhere, #DeleteUber. And we demanded that the Uber CEO at the time, Travis Kalanick, step down from Trump's business council, which he did shortly after we demanded that from him, within a couple days. So Color of Change has long been doing this sort of corporate accountability work. I sort of dislike the idea of corporate accountability, because in some ways it sort of insinuates that we're in bed with corporations, or that we have a reciprocal relationship. But the truth of the matter is, you know, there's so much power in the federal government. And there's, you know, in many ways in this sort of post-Reagan world, there's so much power in corporations, and Color of Change is an organization that does have to watch corporations, has to watch tech platforms, and sort of keep them in line. What we know is that tech corporations are just like any other corporation, in that they seek to exploit workers, they seek to exploit consumers, and we see that happening all the time. I think Coded Bias did an excellent job sort of showing, you know, that cycle of money, right, that passes from maybe your landlord to a surveillance company, maybe from the US government to Palantir. There's money being exchanged, and there's a cycle involved with these tech platforms. They are not our friends because we talk to our friends on them. So
Yeah, we need to remain vigilant, both in our lives, but then how we approach these organizations and understanding that. And I'm personally looking to 2021 to see how we get further in that movement with the new system. I'm going to shift a little bit because I have a few more questions, and I know there's a bunch of questions coming up in the chat. But at Consumer Reports, we do a lot of what we call participatory research, where we work with individuals to investigate the discrepancies and harms that they might face. Is there a way for us to do that with AI? And I'm asking this because this has come up pretty often, that most people are not even sure of when they've been affected by an algorithmic bias. And that proves pretty problematic when you want a lot of people to show the effects of the things that are happening around them. So for this group, is there a way for us to detect and mitigate this, whether it's with a large group of people, as a community, as practitioners? And I just want to throw that out there and see if anyone has any ideas.
Yes, so to this point that you just brought up, how do you know you've been harmed, right? If the systems are opaque, if they're these black boxes, and then sometimes you have the bias whack-a-mole. This issue happens, then you know this issue happens. And right now there's nothing that compels companies to have any kind of transparency with how many systems are being deployed. You don't have agency or control. There's no affirmative consent. And so there's a large part of it that we're trying to look at with the Algorithmic Justice League, which is how do we empower people to even know that there are these harms, but also how do you go from harms discovery to harms redress? Because it's one thing to bring up like, okay, you were harmed. It's another thing to have the accountability so that something is done for that. So we just launched the project, it's ongoing, called Crash. So if you go to crash.ajl.org, the long version, Community Reporting of Algorithmic System Harm Project, Crash, right? But the whole idea, and you can sign up for it, we're working on it right now, is just to get at this point, right? Submit, sometimes we call them bias in the wild stories, right? Or learn about other types of harms that have happened so you can get the sense of, okay, I'm not alone, I'm not by myself. I remember in a panel that I was doing with Trinae and Mr. Santos, Trinae talked about having the audacity to ask in an area or in a space where you might feel you don't know where to start, you don't know the language and so forth. And so in hearing that need, you know, part of what we're trying to do is make sure people do have the language, people do have the examples, right? And people also know that they're going to have the support of various organizations that are not going to leave them hanging. I think the other thing that's been interesting to see, and it comes up online, are kind of these pop audits that happen, whether it's Twitter cropping a thing or in a larger sense, what we saw in the UK with the algorithmic grading, right? You start comparing notes, you're like, wait a minute, and people can mobilize to shut a system down that's not serving them. And so I do think there's a huge need to allow people to, one, even understand the space of algorithmic harms, but also on the other side, the need to have true accountability. And that can be from government, right? That can be from people pushing back their different ways to get to that accountability as well. So check out crash.ajl.org, and there are other projects going on as well.
I can jump in. I think there's also a huge opportunity for education, right? So how do people know that they can have, that they are allowed the audacity to ask, right? So, and I think that's education of the public through, like this film, for example, is a great example of what we're talking about here. There's also some of the things that we're focusing on at the Data Nutrition Project, along with many friends in academic institutions, is curriculum. So as a data scientist, for example, you would be shocked, or maybe not, after watching this movie, there really aren't any standards when it comes to how to interrogate data. So in a lot of other realms, there are steps that you'd need to take to make sure that what you're building is the right thing. There are kind of best practices, or either they're mandated by a company or an organization or a field or a license or something like that. But data science is fairly new. A lot of people are teaching themselves how to be data scientists over YouTube or other things, which is awesome. Democratization of information, great. But there are no standards, and there really aren't any tools either. So there's a huge opportunity to educate people who are building the algorithms and working with the data, because a lot of folks, I've talked to a lot of data scientists, and I say, have you been thinking about bias in your algorithms? And they're like, what do you mean bias? Like mathematical bias? I'm like, oh my God, no. Like, you're building something that's going to determine something for a whole community of people, or a whole country, or 1 billion people, right? Depending on what you're building. And people are just, it's not that they have bad intentions necessarily, but often they just don't even think about it. So I think that there's a huge opportunity for education, kind of on the consumer side, but also of people who are building these systems.
That makes total sense. And Kasia, I do want to shout out to, there's a bunch of teachers that are joining us today who have already talked about how they've been updating their curriculum after watching the documentary, and have been employing it. And there's tons of students here who I know you're with your professors and your teachers. So like I'm already feeling that, like, how are we bringing more into the curriculum? Obviously that's on more of a consumer side, but that is the conversation we need to have to make sure it happens on both sides.
Yeah, huge shout out to our educators, especially at this time during this pandemic. I can only imagine. Actually, I can't even imagine what you're all going through. So thank you. And I've been trying to like stay up with the chat, but it's phenomenally fast. So so I'm sorry I missed that. But yes, huge shout out to educators.
I've been doing the same. I'm like trying to keep up, but everyone's whipping by, and I really appreciate everyone answering each other's questions at this point. So thank you. And I'm capturing some, and I'm making sure they're added. Just to move on to something that has been mentioned in the chat a lot, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up here, is the conversation on what's been happening with Timnet in the last week. She is an artificial intelligence ethics researcher at Google, who was fired after sending a memo requesting Google's decision to silence marginalized voices and demand research integrity. So Joy, you actually pointed at this earlier, and I really did want to come back to this. And as I can imagine, like a lot of people are wanting to address this as well. And she was also in the documentary, which was great. And it's so, it's an important part of the conversation that we should have right now. But, she brings up a very valid point of how do we hold big tech accountable to prioritizing our most vulnerable communities? How do we do that across the institutions, across the research and communities? And especially given, what's harped really hard in the documentary is that usually fancy new technology, it goes first to the rich. And, later on, people who are on the cusps get access to it. But with artificial intelligence and algorithms, it's actually usually predatory around people who are on the cusp, who are poorer, who are more vulnerable. And I'm increasingly aware that this is the community that I want to look out for. And I just want to pose this question to the group, like, how do we protect our most vulnerable communities when it comes to these issues? It's a big question, I know. There's a lot to unpack here.
Well, there are several components to unpack with the story. And so what I want to speak to, because Timnit is a close friend of mine and also a research collaborator. So we are the co-authors of the Gender Shades paper, highly cited, a lot of influence, and the research that is followed through within the film Coded Bias. I wrote an article on Medium about the face queens, right? So that's Timnit Gebru, Dr. Gebru, myself, and also Deb Raji, and what it is like to be in a marginalized group inside institutions that are then further harming the communities you come from, trying to advocate, trying to speak up for others and yourself, and also trying to move the research forward. And so there are a few components here that really stuck out to me, but one of the major components is where can critical research truly happen? Because the areas in which you're going to have access to the models and to the data are inherently going to be opposed to anything that will upset the bottom line at the end of the day. We saw this quite viscerally with Amazon. For the second paper that came out from the Gender Shades project, Deb Raji and I, we replicated the study. This was old news. We were surprised Amazon did so poorly. It's like failing a test where the answer's already out there, but nonetheless, that was the case. And the move was to try to attack our credibility. And Deb was an undergraduate at the time, in grad school. And by that time, Timnit was doing a postdoc. Timnit, she's an incredible researcher. I mean, she has accolades on accolades. So there's no questioning her bona fides. But despite all of her intellectual output, right, and how much mentoring she's done, the way in which Google dismissed her was so dehumanizing. And you have seen Google give cover to sexual harassers, like people who are not trying to advocate for marginalized voices. And so with the Gebru Gate situation, it really put to bear the importance of being able to protect those who want to do the hard-hitting research that actually benefits all of us. It benefits all of society to know the climate impact of AI so we can do it in a different way or question if we want to move forward. It benefits all of us to understand the impact of these large-scale language models, because if you're saying, okay, people on Black Twitter are inherently negative because they bring up racism, and then you start putting them into surveillance because of those situations, these are inherently important questions that nonetheless can challenge a bottom line. And so when I saw again, just the dehumanizing and gaslighting of Timnit, it really broke my heart, but it also made me just see the importance of having spaces and places for people who are marginalized, even within tech to have their voices heard.
Yeah, for me, it also brought up this very stark difference, I think, between leadership and management. And some of the points that Google initially tried to put out there was that, Dr. Gabru's email that she sent to a list of allies and colleagues was kind of not managerial or something. And I just think about the way that we need to consider leadership in tech organizations and what the roles of leaders should be and what our ideal roles for leaders should be. Because to me, Dr. Gabru's email was the quintessential example of leadership. I mean, she was putting everything out there. She was being vulnerable. She was saying, here are things that have happened to me. These are strategies that have not worked for me. These are strategies I think we should employ. And she was really showing her heart and her intellect in that email. And instead, she gets kind of slammed for not being managerial by the leaders of Google. And to me, that whole thing is reversed, right? She was showing true leadership there. And then they made some terrible leadership and management decisions at the end. So I don't have much to add to what Joy said. I feel like that encapsulates most of it. But to me, there's just this really stark difference between, who should our leaders, how should they act? What's the ideal leader? What's that example? And for those who are in management who are not leaders, how do we write that?
I just want to say what a loss I think this is to Google, that a company that also has a radical inclusion problem, like all big tech companies. I learned in my research that AI researchers are 14% women. That's abysmal. 2.5% are Black women. Google can't afford to lose genius like Timnit Gebru in its staffing. I mean, when I think of the fact that like 3 Black women's research exposed bias in AI that the biggest multinational tech companies in the world somehow missed, it is a rally cry for more people like Timnit, like Joy, to be in the room where these decisions are made. And I think Timnit being gone from Google is a loss for all of us.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, at Color Change also, we're clearly very upset about the loss of Timnit Gebru and the way she's been treated. And it's a labor issue in many ways for us. So often companies like Google, particularly we saw this post George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, will release all these, verbose and emotive statements, and they'll spend all this money on advertising and commercials to indicate that to them, Black lives matter. But, at Color of Change, we don't believe that Black lives just matter in death. We believe that they matter in life as well. And it's totally incongruent for a company like Google to say Black lives matter and then treat their actual Black employees like crap. And, we know companies like Google also have, massive labor disparities between their contract employees, which tend to be Black people and low income people and people of color, and the people who actually have the excellent paid parental leave and the great pay and the great vacation leave. And so we know that these companies, like Color of Change, over the summer launched our hub called Beyond the Statement, because we know that it's time for these companies to go beyond the statement. Discrimination and bias show up on every single level in corporations, and simply making a donation, which is a drop in a bucket for these, multi-million-dollar companies, simply is not enough.
I profusely nodded my head throughout everything you all said. And so I couldn't agree more. And I really just appreciate, having that conversation and bringing it in, because it's so important to move beyond the statement, to have these conversations, to share the stories, and also to stand up for those in the community who are facing injustice within the injustice. And that's part of the collective conversation that I was also really excited to have today. So appreciations and thank you. We are coming up on the hour, so I have one question left that is really booming in the chat. And so people are really excited to know. And I think I might derail it to the last line in Coded Bias when you watch it. It says, there is still no US federal regulations of algorithms. That's the last line you're left with. And so in 2021, we have a new Congress coming in and potentially what I hope is new legislation around emerging technologies like facial recognition. And I want to pose to this group, like, where do we see that headed? How do we make sure that this accountability is wrapped up into it? What will be the role of civil society and social justice organizations? And I am particular, like, how do we get some hearings on some of those calendars?
Yeah, I'll just start by saying that it's essential that we have an attorney general that is going to investigate monopolies. We see a little bit of that happened over the past week with Facebook, being under scrutiny. I think 48 states sued Facebook for monopoly. We need regulation from the federal government. The truth of the matter is that in a capitalist economy, these companies are going to take it as far as they can go. They're going to exploit their workforce. They're going to exploit consumers unless they are held accountable. And one of the few levers that we actually have, we have the power of consumers, right? And so Color of Change led, the Stop Hate for Profit campaign over the summer when, massive corporations decided to no longer advertise on Facebook, some for a couple months, some indefinitely, due to Facebook's refusal to moderate, Facebook ads and hate groups that pop up on the platform. But the truth of the matter is that as consumers, we only have so much power. We need the federal government to investigate tech platforms, not only for their labor practices, but also for monopoly. They need regulation. We need Facebook to be broken up. We need Google to be broken up. And we can no longer have, these tech companies become billionaires off of our free data and surveillance. We are getting pennies. We're getting nothing actually. We're just getting be able to interact with our friends, which I guess is, some sort of currency in the pandemic times. But the truth of the matter is these companies are not progressive. They don't have our best interests at heart. They don't care about us at all. They are responsive to public pressure a little bit, but what they're really going to be responsive to is the federal government investigating them. So it's incredibly important that we have an attorney general who's going to seek to regulate tech companies. So we need to be, tweet at the Biden campaign, tweet at the Biden administration and transition team, let them know that having an attorney general who is going to regulate tech companies is that's important to you.
Yeah, I am so excited for 2021 because a lot of what's been going on in the background for regulation, I think, is actually finally going to have an opportunity to find some teeth. And so even though we haven't had federal legislation passed, there have been more and more promising bills like the Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act that was introduced 2020. I think we will have some momentum. One thing that's not in the film, but Shalini was actually there when it happened, is I had an opportunity to brief then Senator Harris on issues of algorithmic bias and issues with face recognition technology and so forth. And she got it. She's like, yes, we need to do, and she got it to the point of drafting letters with 6 other senators to the FBI, to the Federal Trade Commission, to the EEOC, asking, what is the federal government doing to address the new frontiers of algorithmic justice? And so to have a vice president that understands that racial justice requires algorithmic justice, right? That the next part of the other frontiers of civil rights also include algorithmic justice, I think it is incredibly valuable. But also what we've been seeing at the city and at the state level. Right now, we're pushing in Massachusetts to get a face surveillance provision put back into a police reform bill. That fight is going on right now. We'd love to bring in Coded Bias, to the White House, to state legislators, so people also get that human connection as well. When we had the all-out, the full unanimous ban to vote to ban face surveillance in Boston, it happened right after the the story about Robert Williams was made public. And I don't think there is a coincidence that being able to see what it actually means for an individual, right, to be impacted by these systems, and also having the pressure of protest in the streets, people saying, okay, your statements, your platitudes, that's not enough, there will be pressure, made an absolute difference. And so I'm really excited for where we're going to be with 2021. But the thing is, we also have to keep government accountable as well. And you have governments that are adopting various AI systems. So maybe it's a resurgence of the, Office of Technology Assessment. I think there's a lot that can happen in the next 4 years with the administration that we have coming in, but we also need to keep in mind what can happen at the local level, at the state level, and keep our eyes open for what's going on internationally as well. But the movement is rising. Be a part of it.
I think too, if I can just double down on something that Joy, you said at the very end there, which is our international counterpoints and colleagues. I'm super excited in 2021 about our international relationships and picking up and carrying those forward, maybe changing the tone of them than what we've seen for the past few years. I think that at least in Europe, our kind of international counterparts there are very much principles based. So they have a lot of principles based movements around fairness, transparency, interoperability, all of these kinds of principles, where in the US, we're more like, see what goes wrong and then legislate to make sure that doesn't happen again. They're more like top down. So there are white papers that are coming out of the European Commission and other things that I think really fit in and lock in nicely with what we're doing. And we have to remember that data doesn't really know international boundaries. They of course put in place GDPR, which does kind of start to talk about boundaries, but the data that you are entering on your phone here might be sent to servers all around the world. And so we need to think of this as a global movement. And we haven't talked at all about the fact that, Shalini, your film looks at China. I have a lot of feelings about that, also as someone who's half Chinese, but won't get into it now. But I think that this is really a global issue. And we're going to see over the next few years a global response, and it might be varied. But the more that we can work with folks who are pushing the envelope in various ways, I think the more we can drive this forward in a way that's going to be consumer friendly.
I'm just enjoying the conversation. I just want to say that, people always ask, what's the future going to look like? And here's what I'm sure of. I'm sure that an algorithm can't predict it. And how fast we make change is really up to us, and how quickly we support people like that are on this panel and the movements that they represent forward to push this work. I really believe that we have a moonshot moment, much of which has been done by grassroots organizers and researchers and journalists and activists who've been building this movement for a long time. And I really think that we have this sort of moonshot moment to call for ethics in the technologies that will govern our future. And so I really hope that everyone who attended to this panel today will do something, support one of these great organizations that are doing work in the field. I've also seen how local action can make a big difference. And I've seen how technological centers have been the first to ban these technologies. I mean, San Francisco, Oakland, Somerville, they were among the first to ban these facial recognition technology by law enforcement. And some of that is just showing up to your city council meeting with 50 of your friends and trying to get a local ban passed at your college or your university, in your local governance. And these days you don't even have to show up. You can just do a Zoom call and tell them, sort of let your voice be heard. And I really think that there's a big opportunity for local action to swing larger action.
And Shalini, really quickly, just because there's a lot of people in the chat saying, like, how do I view this after today, after the viewing ends? And the educators are like, I need to show this next semester. Can you give us a quick line on
Absolutely.
how do people do that?
Well, you can go to codedbias.com. If you go to virtual cinema, it's playing at a lot of local movie theaters right now around the country. So you can support a local movie theater and stream it from the safety of your home, both. So it's codedbias.com. You can also go to the Take Action page, and it's a central database for reading materials for great organizations like AJL and Color of Change and ACLU and others, where you can sort of take action. And for educators, it's available at Women Make Movies. And we are looking forward to a PBS release in spring of 2021.
Yes. And deep thanks to our community that has joined us today, and for all of our panelists for all of their wisdom. As a special treat, our own Poet of Code is going to leave us on a poetic note. Joy, all you.
Take it away. Okay, so for those of you who saw the film, you might have heard a few of these verses, but I wanted to give you the entire To the Brooklyn Tenants poem. You ready? All right. To the Brooklyn tenants, resisting and revealing the lie that we must accept the surrender of our faces, the harvesting of our data, the plunder of our traces. We celebrate your courage. No silence, no consent. You show the path to algorithmic justice requires a league, a sisterhood, a neighborhood, hallway gatherings, Sharpies and posters, coalitions, petitions, testimonies, letters, data nutrition labels, color change come through. Filmmakers like Shalini, Consumer Reports putting together these kinds of systems. Dancing and music, research and potlucks, everyone playing a role to orchestrate change. To the Brooklyn tenants and freedom fighters around the world, persisting and prevailing against algorithms of oppression, automating inequality through weapons of math destruction. We stand with you in gratitude. You demonstrate the people have a voice and a choice when defiant melodies harmonize to elevate human life, dignity, and rights. The victory is ours. Thank you.
Yes. I love that vibe to end on. Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you so much, Jade. Kasia and Shalini, appreciate you putting your time into this and all the energy and love to the discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone joining us again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, all.